Good evening. I'm Isabella with the Engagement Programs Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to today's virtual lecture on the Obama portraits with Sam Ramos. We're so glad to have you joining us virtually, and we hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Sam Ramos has been with the Art Institute's Department of Learning and Public Engagement since 2017 and currently serves as an educator and associate director in the Department of Innovation and Creativity. Outside of his time at the museum, Sam writes fiction, essays, and art criticism. His fiction and essays have appeared in a number of publications in print and online, including the Chicago Tribune, the Austin Chronicle, and Fiction Magazine. His novel, La Gloria, was included on the Zank Prize for Fiction longlist in November of 2018. He teaches extensively in both galleries and classrooms on a range of topics, which include race and power and the intersections between art and medical practice. Thank you so much for being here, Sam, and please take it away.
Thank you, Izzy. I really appreciate that. Thanks everybody for tuning in and spending a little bit of time with us this evening to talk about these amazing and complicated portraits. We don't have a ton of time, and so my goal really is to share some information and also share some interpretations and perspective art historically and culturally around these images to really help enhance and inform how you appreciate them on your own time. And hopefully you've had the opportunity to visit them in person or will later on this summer. They're going to be in the museum on view for a few weeks. If you haven't seen them already, I hope you get the chance to see them. If you have seen them already, I hope you can see them again. I do not want to present this as a definitive way of understanding the portraits, just some perspective, my point of view based on my interests in research and understanding of the images, and that might help enrich your own perspective as you develop your particular relationship with them through time, not just now this summer, but these are going to be with us for the ongoing future. And so how will our relationships change with them over time? So with all that said, and with such a short amount of time, I want to go ahead and dive in. First, I wanted to start with this quote from beloved American author, who is also author of the novel Beloved, Toni Morrison, who passed away a few years ago and had visited with the Obamas, had a relationship with them, and who they very much admired. Whenever she passed away a few years ago, President Obama wrote that her writing was, quote, a beautiful, meaningful challenge to our conscience and our moral imagination. And I think this quote is really indicative of her kind of wisdom. She says definitions belong to the definers and not the defined, which I read as an empowerment of individuals, of people over preconceived notions and preconceived definitions, that we get to decide who we are and create new definitions as we move through the world, which I see as very relevant to an understanding of the Obama administration, and the artists we're going to be talking about, Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald, and the individual paintings. I also want to share this very short quote from a hip hop artist who I love, named Kendrick Lamar. This is just a line from one of his songs called Humble. And he says, Obama just paged me to indicate this relationship that he had with the Obamas. And this is a great song, but also selected by President Obama during one of his yearly music playlists, best of playlists. And so I'd recommend taking a look at it, not just as a fun piece of music, but also as a piece of poetry, a piece of literature, a piece of art in its own right, but then also as an example of what makes this particular moment and this particular presidency unique, that cultures were brought together that maybe had not been in the past. Traditions and expectations clashing, but then also melding with other traditions and expectations and questions and ideas. In this case, the White House and hip hop, and famously the Hamilton cast made one of their first really high profile performances in the White House, again, bringing American history and the White House and hip hop culture and Black culture into this space where previously it had been very, very different. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the portraits themselves. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot of visual information. And so in an effort to avoid being overwhelmed by all of that, I do want to take them just one at a time. And I want to start with Amy Sherrill's portrait of Michelle Obama. So just taking a moment to slow down and really just sort of take it in, take a look, to note maybe the soft blue background, the sort of flatness of it, to note the structural composition of her dress, the brightness and asymmetry of the pattern in the dress, the way the folds fall, the way that the image and the dress have been cropped. And then of course, Michelle herself and her gesture, the way she's seated, even just the fact that she is seated, the lay of her arms, the arc of her hand underneath her chin and the arc of her hand over her knee, the fall of the waves of her hair, the length of her hair, the shade of paint and color that was used to create the skin tones here. And then her expression and her gaze, where it's directed and what that expression maybe contains, what we might read into it if we were to walk into a room and see her. So I want to break that down just a little bit more. And I'm sure that you may be seeing other things already as you're taking a look. These are just a couple of images of the artist Amy Sherrill in her studio working with the portrait and trying to put it together. And in this case, of course, it looks like it's pretty close to complete. Take note of the photograph that's on her working desk here. You can see a full color photograph that's a detail of the gesture of the hand in the portrait. And then also maybe some of the tones that Amy Sherrill has on these paper plates that she's working from as palettes. And then her use of digital technology. You have her laptop and you have her phone, that this is a multimedia experience. And then not to mention, of course, the painting itself, which is right there behind her on the wall. This is an image, of course, of Amy Sherrill and Michelle Obama outside together wearing the iconic dress and then talking together about what the painting might be like. Amy Sherrill says that she typically uses photography in order to capture her models before she actually does the painting. So, and Kehinde Wiley does the same thing. So photography has a big role in the development of these paintings. And I'm going to talk some more about that as we go along. And then this one you saw a brief flicker of a moment ago, but Mrs. Obama sitting outside in the pose that we recognize from the painting in a very different setting, of course. The background, something that's very notably removed from the final painting, but in a large part looking very much like what we are familiar with. And I want to draw our attention in particular for the moment to the dress itself. Amy Sherrill said that whenever she painted the dress, she wanted to actually create something that felt like an inanimate object. In the sense that she wanted it to feel structural. She used the word mountain. She wanted it to feel like maybe Michelle Obama is on a mountain, that she's on some kind of piece of architecture. And she actually cropped the photograph because she could have included the entire dress in the painting, but she chose not to. She wanted to position it in such a way that it almost feels like its own entity, like it could exist as its own painting. And she was very intentional, well, not only about the dress, which was created by a fashion designer that Michelle Obama had worked with before named Michelle Smith, but then also in reference to some artists that Amy Sherrill very much admires, the women who are quilters at Gee's Bend, Alabama. And these are generations of quilters that go back to whenever slavery was still in place in the United States. Slaves learning how to quilt and sew and then teaching it to one another, teaching it to daughters and generations throughout time all the way up until today. And this is a photo of Amy Sherrill herself with the quilters at Gee's Bend. And you can see an example of a mural of one of the quilts behind them. And then she's holding one of the quilts. And then here's a close-up of a quilt by Marlene Bennett Jones. There's a fantastic kind of richness to the stories behind these quilts and behind the individuals who made them. So if you go to the website for the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which supports a lot of the work of the quilters, you can see photographs and biographies that go back multiple generations around the creation of these quilts and these techniques. And you can see compositionally in terms of the color, in terms of the kind of liveliness and even the disorderliness and the warmth of these compositions, how they informed and are represented in the dress of Michelle Obama. And I want to go back just a second again to take a look at the, again, at this little example of a quilt from Gee's Bend. So we're talking a little bit about that history behind the pattern that's taking place in Michelle Obama's dress. Just that being something that's very unique. We were talking about a high-profile portrait of a woman and a powerful female cultural figure and also political figure. And this history around slavery and making and womanhood that goes into just the pattern of the dress. And that being one of the things that can make this painting very powerful and unique. But I also want to talk about it more broadly, just as an image of a very influential female figure and how that fits into the kind of arc of art history and representations of women in power, which is why, as you saw perhaps for a second earlier, I wanted to include this image of Queen Elizabeth I. It's, I think, probably looks a bit fantastic in comparison to the Michelle Obama painting. You have a lot of jewelry. You have a really broad composition, a really broad figure. She's got a hand on the globe. It's not a very subtle gesture toward the amount of power that she wielded after the British defeated the Spanish Armada, which you can see represented in the background. Which is notable if we're thinking about backgrounds, and both Amy Sherald and Kehinde Wiley are very deliberate about how they think about the backgrounds of their images. And we'll talk about Kehinde Wiley's background in just a second, but also you see the crown, of course, in the background here. Just even the gaze sort of facing off into the distance. So a lot happening here to indicate what power looks like. And for this particular female figure following in the footsteps of what had been primarily male royalty before her, or kings in particular. I wanted to include this one. We were jumping up a few centuries, but when I was thinking about and contemplating, iconic paintings of influential female figures, I thought of this Picasso painting of Gertrude Stein, who was not of the profile, the kind of global notoriety of a Michelle Obama or Queen Elizabeth the First, but she is, as the 20th century unfolded, has became a very well-known and influential artist and poet, a writer, and a cultural figure. And in this case, you can see some similarities in terms of composition and how this painting was approached. She's filling the frame in a similar way. She's seated. Her dress is very different in the sense that it's more muted, it's darker, the background is darker, and she seems to be kind of looking off, sort of down and off into the distance. But there's something still, even though she's looking away from us, that's very kind of solid and maybe even imposing about this approach to female portraiture that Picasso tried. But something that I thought was maybe even more applicable, that felt very much in line with some of the ambitions of Amy Sherald and her portrait of Michelle Obama, was this very contemporary portrait, photography portrait by a local artist, Chicago artist named Zakia Najiba. The image is from a series that Najiba has been working on, and this particular photo in that series is called Chelsea. And Najiba described this person, this subject, Chelsea, as somebody who is an academic, who is a PhD, who is doing a lot of research around what it means to be queer, what it means to be Black, what it means to be femme, and what femininity can look like whenever, even in this case, you have somebody who's sitting casually. This is not a super choreographed portrait in the same way that the Michelle Obama is, or the Queen Elizabeth. This was a candid photograph that captured somebody in a moment of recognition and directness, where she's directing her gaze directly right at us. And though this is a casual setting, they appear to be very powerful and to be meeting us on their own terms. I do want to, again, I mentioned earlier photography as something that both Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald use as part of their process of making their work. In their case, they typically just walk up to people on the street who they're compelled by, especially and particularly in the Black community, and people who are not necessarily celebrities at all, who do not have a lot of power, and then giving them a chance to be represented permanently in their artwork. And so photography is a very important part of their process. This made me think of Lorna Simpson, who is a notable African-American artist who has done a lot of really fascinating conceptual photography. And in this case, you have another portrait, but of a very different type that's relying on photography. In this case, 3 photographs of a woman whose face we can't necessarily see and who's wearing this kind of ambiguous white dress of some kind that's covering her up, and then she appears to be kneeling. And then Lorna Simpson has combined the image with text in order to tell a story and ask some sort of complicated questions. And a lot of Lorna Simpson's work references sexuality, it references slavery, it references race, and it's very much in reference to the body as well. And I think notable that it uses photography in order to do so. I also wanted to note Colleen Smith, another contemporary artist, a Black female artist, whose work we have in the Art Institute collection. We've had some of her work on display recently, and one of my favorites. And this is a still from a film that she did called Dry Long So, a film back in the early 90s, or excuse me, the late 90s, when she was more concentrated on kind of mainstream narrative film as opposed to the more conceptual installation-based work that she does now. And in this case, a character, a young Black woman who walks around her community and takes Polaroids of young Black men in particular as a way of recording them, because she's so struck by the high death rates of young Black men. And she's worried that if someone doesn't take their picture and capture them, that they might never be remembered after, if and when they're gone. So coming back to Amy Sherald specifically, this is an image from and I apologize, you can't really see some of the captions on the slides, but this is a still image that was collected by W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century. He wanted to collect photographs of Black individuals so that he could try to basically collect images of Black people that didn't fall into the stereotypes that he was used to seeing, the kind of minstrelly, very insulting and degrading images that people would often see of Black individuals. He was finding a very different type of imagery in photography. And so he wanted to bring them all together. And Amy Sherald saw these images and she felt very connected to them. She talked about, finding her painting and the way that she worked turning into a meditation, is the word that she used, on the practice of photography. And she talked very much about the photography, the photographic record of her own family, and in particular her grandmother, and these expressions, especially of women, and how it inspired the way that she represents figures in her painting. So just coming back to the Michelle Obama image again, I want to talk about one of the most perhaps even controversial parts of her paintings, but I think one of the most fascinating and very complicated parts of her paintings, and that is the skin tone. And a lot of people asked right away, as soon as this image was unveiled in 2018, why the gray instead of maybe more naturalistic skin tones that people might recognize. And she has multiple reasons. And I think one of the most compelling being that, she can answer that question, but the answer is going to keep changing because even she doesn't completely know. I want to go ahead and just share a handful of her other work so you can see that this is something that she returns to again and again, and also just to see some more examples of her amazing work. One thing I would call attention to, and I would suggest if you haven't in the past that you maybe Google some more of her work and take a close look at her titles. We started this conversation talking about Toni Morrison and Kendrick Lamar's poetry. And I really think that there's a lot of meaning in her titles for her work, other than the Obama portraits, that can be really compelling and worth unpacking. And I won't spend too much time doing now, but and then of course this image of a Black woman with a camera looking directly at us, perhaps about to take our picture. And one more example here. But that skin tone, and Amy Sherrill describes it in a few different ways, and one of which is that well, first of all, she came across it not entirely intentionally, that the gray scale approach to the skin color was something that was just sort of the process of layering paint, and that earlier on in her career, the figures at one point would have this gray skin, but then she would go over it later with a more kind of naturalistic skin tone. But one day she decided, she got to this point where the figure was in this grayscale, and then she decided to just finish the rest of the painting and then leave the skin until later. And then she decided that she actually liked it. There was something happening with the skin color that she just wanted to keep, that struck her. And so she stayed with it, and she just kept doing it, returning to it again and again. And one of the explanations that she gives for that is that she wanted her figures to not be too specifically tied to their identity, to their racial identity, that she wanted them to be recognizable to Black Americans, people looking at the artwork who maybe had considered themselves Black. She wanted them to be able to recognize themselves in the images, but she didn't want the image to be just about that. And so my perspective, based on what she said, is that she's asking a question every time she presents these figures with this gray skin. What is race? What is Blackness? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a Black person looking at this image? What does it mean to be a person who is not Black looking at this image? And so those questions continue. And it's a really pretty fascinating and organic conceptual approach to color. And something that we can keep thinking about with her work, but that also other artists are thinking about as well. Kerry James Marshall is a prominent example that comes to mind. This is one of his paintings, Mini Mansions, that's in the Art Institute collection. And you can see the figures, they're very dark skin tones. And it's, it's unlikely you're going to find a lot of people who are as dark as these figures here. So there's something stylized and even abstracted about that. And Kerry James Marshall, this is a still from a documentary about him, showing some of his, the paints that he uses. And he describes that, these all look like the same color Black, but actually when you start using them and layering them on top of each other, they start to do different things. That the Blackness itself is a complicated concept and a complicated idea, especially for a painter. So Amy Sherrill, I see is sort of falling into that tradition. So returning again to, one last time to Michelle Obama's portrait specifically, sort of last major idea I wanted to note, she doesn't necessarily always consider herself a portrait artist. She considers herself a painter, and she considers the works that she makes paintings as opposed to portraits. And this is a painting that she did of Breonna Taylor for Vanity Fair. And Breonna Taylor, there's much to say, but if you don't recall, she's somebody who was killed by police in a botched raid. She was innocent. They made a lot of mistakes, and she died for those mistakes. And she's become an icon and a martyr around resistance and against systemic racism in the United States. And Amy Sherrill made this painting of her that she considers a portrait, she says, because she considers most of her paintings, she wants them to feel more universal. She doesn't necessarily want those paintings to be tied to a specific individual. But the Michelle Obama portrait and this Breonna Taylor portrait, she says, are very much about those individuals. They are stories about those individuals. And so she does consider them portraits. It's an interesting way to think about, how one talks about portraiture and what a portrait is. And then I just wanted to include this image that you may have seen. It's just a fantastic painting or photograph, just a phone photograph of a young girl in awe of the Obama portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. So I want to go ahead and switch gears to the Barack Obama portrait by Kehinde Wiley. And again, take just a moment to take it in for a few minutes or for a few seconds, really, because we're running low on time. But to think about gesture, to think about how this figure is seated, what he's wearing, what he's sitting on, where is the ground in this? Where does the background start? Where does it end? What is the background doing? What are the colors that we're thinking about? What's the mood and attitude of this image? And how is that happening? And then again, turning to the expression. What does that expression say to us? How are we being confronted by it, if confronted is the right word? So I have just a couple of still photographs of the artist Kehinde Wiley with the president as they're working on the portrait. And you can see them kind of talking through, thinking about the process together. And Kehinde Wiley himself working on the portrait. And you can see again this use of photography, a very important part of the process. So Kehinde Wiley has a real interest in power, and here's a quote from him as he was talking about how he and President Obama approached working on this painting together. He said, "We are trying to figure out a language that looked at the vocabulary of power, but almost walked right past it. To be able to look at him squarely and to say, what is it that defines you in terms of body language? What are the contours of your relationship to the public? And how can I be of service to make that into something that lives, something that's timeliness and something that's a bit surprising?" There's another great quote that I just found today that I also want to share from Kehinde Wiley in thinking about portraiture and what it means and maybe what it has to do with power in a way. And he said, "Andy Warhol said that we would all have our 15 minutes. The 15 minutes. I'm going to give you a painting and I'll make you live forever." Another quote from Kehinde Wiley. So thinking about power and thinking about imagery, I immediately started thinking about portraits that were created by the Romans and how they kind of perfected the use of portraiture and representation as ways to distribute the concept of an individual as someone who is powerful and bigger than life. In this case, this is a portrait bust of Emperor Hadrian. I want to look at a specific anecdote about Emperor Hadrian as it pertains to these concepts of portraiture, his relationship with his lover, Antinous, seen here in another Roman bust. Antinous was Hadrian's lover. Antinous drowned in the Nile by accident. We don't exactly know how. And Hadrian, devastated forever, was to begin creating sculptures of him and to distribute them across the Roman Empire. In some cases, conflating images of Antinous with images of Egyptian and Roman gods. And they did the same thing with coins. Early on, very early on, city-states and around the Roman Empire made their own coins, and typically they made them with gods on them. But eventually, Roman authorities and Roman emperors realized that if they put their own faces on these coins, which previously had been reserved for gods, then they could share in some of that power and this currency would be spread across Rome. And it was a great way to distribute, again, your power through imagery, through your portrait across a vast landscape. And of course, we do the same thing with dollar bills. And, not to go too far off on a tangent, but I also, in particular, thinking about Western art history, which Kehinde Wiley is very much engaged with and very much in making his work in response to. This is an image of an illuminated manuscript from the 14th, 15th century or so. And we may not realize it, but, back then there was a power to an image of, especially of a religious figure, as we have here, the birth of Christ, that the image itself wasn't just an image completely separate from the subject themselves, but that it actually embodied some of the power and spirit of that subject. And, a really simple example is, think about if you have a photograph of a loved one, a really cherished photograph that maybe is even just on your phone and you delete it. Would you ever do that on purpose? And most people wouldn't. And if you think about a physical photograph, how does it feel to tear that in half? These are, I'm troubled even just kind of thinking about it because I don't want to do that. There's something that's goes beyond just the image itself to something more powerful. It's about our relationship to that person and how they are embodied in that object. And so that's something that was very much in the tradition of Western art history that Kehinde Wiley is working in response to. And something that, Henry VIII understood. This is a famous portrait of power, portrait of Henry VIII in the Walker Art Gallery in London. And very similar to his daughter's portrait, Queen Elizabeth I. Again, just filling up the space, really broad shoulders, wide stance, filling up this large painting, and in this case, looking directly at us. And this is a confrontation. And this is his conception of power, and very much in line with a lot of other portraits in European and American art history. And here are some examples. These are all from the Art Institute's collection. Kehinde Wiley said that he would grow up going to museums and seeing images like these, and he felt alienated by them because they were all white, they were all old, they were all wearing these costumes, but then he also felt compelled by them. He was drawn to them, and then really recognized so many of them as being very great paintings, even if he didn't necessarily relate to the material. And he said that instead of feeling pushed away, he felt inspired to become a great painter himself so that he could work in the same way and make it his own. And so that was his approach to that. And then I had to include this painting of King George III, who of course was king during the American Revolution. And this is a painting, a well-known painting by Jacques-Louis David, who's one of the frequent European artists that Kehinde Wiley has been inspired by and wanted to respond to, of Napoleon crossing the Alps on horseback. Certainly dramatized, not very realistic, but very much about, what will make Napoleon look good and look influential and powerful. And then a painting by Kehinde Wiley made in response to that painting of Napoleon. Very similar, but changing the subject matter entirely and giving us a very different type of background, and really turning the volume up on this image and making it feel much more like something that, we have to confront in a different way and that we can't take for granted. And in his case, finding young Black men in different communities, not only in America, but also in Africa and elsewhere, and then giving them this power, imbuing them with this power. I want to share a few examples of presidential portraits. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of them. This is one of the most famous, this Lansdowne portrait of George Washington from 1796. And then just a few others. James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, John F. Kennedy, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. And there's a variety of things to say about all of them. The one thing that I would note about George W. Bush's is that he's one of the few that's smiling. And that's, there's a tradition of not smiling in portraiture, especially of powerful people. And so what does it mean to choose a smile? But then what did it mean for Amy Sherrill and Kehinde Wiley independently, not allowed to speak to each other while they were making their artworks, their portraits of the Obamas, for them both to independently choose to not let their figures, their subjects smile in their portraits, and what does that imply? So just turning one more time to the portrait of President Obama as we wrap up in this last minute or two here before we take a handful of questions. How does all this history impact the way that we read this portrait? How are we going to read it in the future? And how are we going to read them together? We can see them online. We can take them in as individual stories, as individual portraits. We can also try to see them as a couple because that's very much a part of their story as well. Amy Sherrill said recently in an Art Institute program that she did in conversation with Kehinde Wiley, that she felt like, they'd worked, it was amazing that they worked on these independently because she feels like they go together so well. And that she could totally imagine Michelle Obama and President Obama just walking off of the canvases, and that she said that they would just look great together. And even though they're composed very differently and have different styles and are approached very differently by the two very different artists, they have some very significant commonalities. And so I think that what she says makes a lot of sense, and I totally agree. So I'm going to go ahead, there's so much more to say, but I want to go ahead and conclude there and then invite some of the questions that I think Izzy is going to share for us in our last few minutes here.
Thank you, Sam. That was so great and such a great overview for the Obama Portraits exhibition. And before we get started with the questions, I also wanted to thank everyone for their patience when we had a bit of a technical problem in the beginning. And I wanted to let you know that the full program recording will be available on YouTube in the near future. And with that said, I think we're ready for the first question. And I want to start off by asking you if you think that the Obama portraits will change the way we look at presidential portraiture in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is, like I said earlier, I think there are a lot of different ways to interpret the portraits and their place in history, and some of the context and speculation and perspective I was offering are some questions that might help us think about these things. But the portraits are going to be with us for, every administration that comes after this, when the official portraits are made, and not just of the president, but also of the first lady or of the president and the first gentleman. Are going to be compared to these portraits, I think, in a way that, they have not been compared to any other specific previous presidential portraiture, because the previous ones are so much alike. And some of them are better than others as art, goes. But these are just of a totally different approach. And it's a very different moment, and makes sense that they would have been made now. And so I think, just as the Obamas themselves are going to be a milestone in American history, I think that the paintings are definitely going to be milestones in art history as well.
That's great. And since you are on the topic of history, what do you think that these two portraits specifically add to that history of presidential portraiture that we've seen so far?
Well, I think they give a few things, and I'm sure that there are people out there who have ideas as well, and I hope that you all get a chance to talk about them and think about them. But one is that you have you can't separate these portraits and this presidency from social justice issues, racial issues in the United States, in America, and in history. They are those are going to continue to be things that are specific to these portraits, that can't be they won't be able to be ignored when people are making additional portraits in the future, and that whatever we're thinking about presidential in general, and then also they're going to give us an indication of what's possible. And I think that's maybe one of the things that's most exciting about these portraits, is that because the artists were selected the way they were by these specific people, by President Obama and Michelle Obama and the advisors around them, they are going to, how can I put it? They're portraits that are changing the way they make it. They're going to make it possible, as Toni Morrison said in that earlier quote, to redefine what it means to make a portrait, to redefine what it means to be a president, and even to redefine what it means to be an American. So if somebody walks into the National Portrait Gallery, or if they just go online and look at the White House, they're going to see something different whenever they look at these images that they just wouldn't have seen without them. And that's going to continue to be the case. So the fact that they change the dynamic completely, I think, is something that's going to stick with us, and a really important contribution to art history that's not going to go anywhere, because they're so iconic, and this is just what we're going to see whenever we think about presidential portraiture going forward.
That's a really great answer. Thank you. Could you speak a little bit to the materials that the artists used to create these portraits?
Yeah, well, in the most basic way, they used, Kehinde Wiley uses typically oil on canvas, and then Amy Sherald uses what's typically listed as oil on linen, which is, largely similar, but linen is a little bit finer. It's just a different kind of quality canvas, basically. And so essentially they're both oil painters. But I would note again that we think a lot about, what's the material that goes into the image that we're seeing right in front of us. But I want to echo again the importance of photography as a medium that's being used to construct these portraits, and the process of modeling that goes into all of that. So, and one thing also that I think it's a little odd to think of it as a medium, but it's their relational quality, the way that both Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald use their relationships to individuals in the community to find their subject matter. There's a great story that I read about Kehinde Wiley in Africa, just going out into the public, finding all these crowds of young men and approaching them. He brings little stacks of images of his own work, and then he shows it to them and says, I want to paint you like this. And then he has to try to convince them to let him take their picture and connect with him so he can make their paintings. And so I think that relational quality and their relationship to their communities is kind of a medium that they work with as well.
That's great. And speaking of communities, what do you hope our member community takes away from these portraits as they explore the rest of the museum after seeing these?
To me, one of the most important things you can take away is that art, museums don't have to be any specific thing. I think that we tend to take things for granted after they've been done. So it may be easy for a lot of us, including myself, to look at, what Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald already made and say, oh, that was inevitable. Or, I'm glad that happened. Yeah, I'm on board. But then how do we remain primed and open to things that have not yet been done? So if someone's taking a risk or seems like they're about to take a risk that we're uncomfortable with, or if they're making an artwork that we don't yet understand, or if they're asking questions that we're not yet comfortable with, how do we find a way to be comfortable and ready, and so that we can take in those things and become a part of that process in a really productive and kind of communal collaborative way. And so I would hope that people would see not just the change that has happened, but the potential for change that's represented by these images. And I think that that's applicable to members of the Art Institute, but to anybody who looks at art.
That's great. I wanted to thank you again, Sam, for sharing your time and knowledge with us and being so thoughtful in all of your responses to these questions. This program is presented in conjunction with the exhibition, The Obama Portraits, which is on view through August 15th. For more information on our upcoming virtual events, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.